everyone, my name is Daisy, and today I will be discussing the evolution of herpetology, specifically with amphibians. We will be highlighting their phylogeny, ecological significance, and the adaptations that have allowed them to thrive in various environments. During today's presentation, we will be focusing on the evolutionary origins of amphibians, their diversification, the key phylogenetic findings, and how their unique adaptations have contributed to their success across different ecosystems. By the end of the presentation, we will be also answering two main questions. Where are they most diverse and where are they least diverse, as well as what their advantages are. Before we dive any deeper into the diversification of amphibians, we will go ahead and start with their tree of life. Amphibians belong to the class Amphibia and the subclass of Lysomophibia, which are going to be all modern-day amphibians. And from there, they will break up into three primary groups: the Anora, which are frogs and toads; Caudata, which are salamanders and newts; and last but not least, the Gymnophonia, which are going to be caecilians. This slide is just specifically for more visualizations of that phylogenetic family tree for amphibians. The one on the right side is the one I will be primarily talking about, which really just shows the diversification within the orders of the groups. So with the Anora, which are those toads and frogs, approximately 7,047 species are within that group. In the Caudata, which are that salamander and newts, we've got approximately 758 species. And again, last but not least, in the Gymnophonia, there is approximately 206 species. Within each group, you'll also see it broken up a little bit more with that color coding and just showing how large each group is. So now we are going to go ahead and start discussing the introduction to amphibians evolution as well as their most recent phylogenies. This is just going to be a brief overview as we get more in depth into our future slides. But amphibians first emerged around 370 million years ago during the Devonian period. This was a critical step in the evolutionary process as it's what allowed for animals to transition from just a pure aquatic lifestyle to that terrestrial lifestyle. This really paved the foundation for all reptiles, birds, and mammals in our modern day society. From there, approximately 315 million years ago, the first reptiles were introduced, and that was during the Carboniferous period, where they evolved from labyrinthodonts, which are the first vertebrates with teeth. As we previously mentioned with the phylogenetic tree, our class Amphibia can be broken down into three main orders. That's our Anora, which are the frogs and toads. They're going to have those characteristics of the tailless, long hind legs, jumping, smoother watery skin, and are going to be the most diverse of the three groups. From there, we'll have our salamanders and newts, or Caudata, which are going to be the elongated bodies, tails, and smooth, moist skin. And they're going to look very similar to our modern-day lizards in the Reptilia family, as well as our Gymnophonia, which are caecilians. They're going to be legless and typically burrowing species. So the next two slides, I will be talking about the time-calibrated phylogeny, as well as the key findings done from that research. The research and study was based off of the article, Did True Frogs Dispersify? By Kin Un Chan and Raphael M. Brown. This was allowing a study to be done on 77% of all known frog diversity, which is one of the largest studies done in regards to amphibians. It was able to utilize the molecular data using the multi-locus molecular data set, which included 2 mitochondria genes as well as 2 nuclear genes, through fossil calibration, which allowed for scientists to accurately date the phylogenetic tree and infer their divergence times, which is really what allowed us to see when amphibians split off, when their orders split off, reptilians, and things of that nature. The phylogenetic analysis, which created the phylogeneity by estimating using the Bayesian program BEAST. This allowed the estimation of phylogenetic relationships and the incorporation of the time collaborations to produce a chronogram. And lastly, the MCMC chains were used. This was able to create a model to converge on a set of phylogenetic trees, generating a distribution of likely evolutionary trees and divergent times. Based off of the study that was created, we were allowed to go a little bit more in depth with that divergence timing. This analysis revealed that true frogs began their global expansion during the late Asoni epoch as well as the Oligocene epochs. During this time, there were even 11 major dispersal events from 3 colonizations of Indian subcontinents, 2 colonizations of Europe by the species in the genre Pelepax and Rana, 2 colonizations of the Americas by the species of Rana, and other significant colonizations into the Philippines, Africa, and Australia, Asia. So this is going to go ahead and highlight those major dispersal events as well. From there, we went ahead and looked at the no shift in diversification rates. So interestingly enough, even despite these major biographic movements, with the species being able to diversify and move continents, this really did not lead to increased net diversification. It actually stayed fairly stagnant or later on caused a decrease within these species. And then last but not least, one thing that I found to be really important was the consistency with previous studies. So even though this was a much larger study with that 77% of frogs, it stayed very constant to the phylogeny, which was previously done with lessly dense sampled phylogenies of true frogs, even with a variation of plus or minus 5 million years. Now that we have discussed the study, I want to go ahead and talk about the origin of amphibians. As briefly mentioned at the beginning of today's presentation, they did go ahead and start coming about during the Devonian age, and amphibians were not the first tetrapods. The first tetrapods were actually known to be fully aquatic animals. However, they did diverge from the stock amniotes, which would later be ancestors to modern-day reptilias or reptiles and amphibians. This did go ahead and jump into the Pennsylvanian epoch age, where amphibians evolved from the aquatic lifestyle to the terrestrial one. This lasted more than 80 million years from that early Devonian time period into that early Pennsylvanian epoch. So it took about 80 million years from them to become the aquatic tetrapods to that terrestrial tetrapods, allowing them to merge on land. The 2 necessary traits that allowed for that was the development of lungs in order to breathe oxygen and air on land, as well as the appendages from their internal skeleton support. They were not meant to support their whole body, however, they were able to support parts of their mass during times as they were walking. These land traits that would later need to be required was the head mobility to move food to their mouth, as well as tongues that would allow them to manipulate food a little bit more. Through this development of keratonin tissues, the skin also became more resistant, which allowed for less dehydration issues. So those are going to be the 2 necessary traits that allowed them to go from aquatic to terrestrial, and then those land traits that allowed them to stay on land during the second part of their life. We also went ahead and jumped into the Triassic period, where the Tribocarachus mosinardi is especially important. I probably butchered that scientific name completely, but this is an amphibian that had many frog-like traits. It was not a true frog, but this is what allowed for frogs to begin evolving in the middle of the Jurassic period. So as frogs began to evolve, we got our first taste of those proto-frogs during the Jurassic to Neogenic period. We also saw our first proto-salamanders appear with the more diverse of living salamanders. That evolved towards the end of the Jurassic period, which then kind of went into our Cenozoic era. This is where all of our modern day salamander families started to appear. This is approximately 66 million years ago. So we got our proto-salamanders during the Jurassic and Neogenic period, and then our more modern salamanders in the Cenozoic era. This then goes into the modern day Lismophobia. This is where all of our 3 living orders of amphibians now list, all of our modern day amphibians, the frogs, toads, the salamanders and newts, and our caecilians or chalians, where we have our 2 major clades. The Gymnophonia and Batrachia the later containing those 3 clades that I just mentioned, and then our prototypes, now extinct, were placed into a different category of their own called the Salatonia and the Urodela. So if you're ever looking at a phylogenetic tree and you see that breaking off or that emergence, that is going to be where all of our prototype amphibians lived. This leads us into that axis of evolution. So this is some of those adaptations, strategies, and traits that started to evolve that really gave way to amphibians. That first one being ecological adaptations. Amphibians are occupying a variety of habitats such as terrestrial, aquatic, arboreal, fossorial environments, and they've been able to adapt to specific environments or habitats like the wetlands, forests, and deserts. So this allowed for significant morphological and behavioral change, really is what shaped their evolutionary trajectories. We then got at the reproductive strategies. Amphibians show considerable diversification in their reproductive strategies, which we will dive in a little bit further as well. The geographic range and dispersal. So geographic isolation due to physical barriers such as those mountains, rivers, and changes to landmass also led to multiple allopatric speciations within amphibians. Our morphological evolution, where amphibians exhibit significant variation in body forms, such as those elongated bodies, robust limbs, and the webbed feet. Those are all going to be allowing for very specialization species to live in very specialized habitats. You've got the thermoregulation and climate adaptation, where amphibians, being ecthromemic or cold-blooded, are highly dependent on the external temperatures to regulate their body functions, and that's going to be a very similar trait that you will see in reptiles as well. And then the genetic drift and population bottlenecks. Because many of these species are often in small isolated populations, they do typically get affected very strongly from that genetic drift and the population bottlenecks. This again is really going to influence those evolutionary paths that they are taking. So this is really going to just jump into the morphological advantages for amphibians. We briefly discussed some of those adaptations and the axis of evolution, and just kind of breaking it up to where amphibians were able to evolve from. But those morphological advantages really allowed for them to really diversify. The first one being that moisture-dependent skin. This really helps them staying hydrated without actually needing to drink water. This allows them to be heavily suited for most moist environments like wetlands, tropics, forests, rainforests. It also allows them to breathe through their skin and drink water through their skin. So they won't actually drink water via their mouth like most animals. Based off of that moisture-dependent skin, it also goes into that respiratory advantage. And with their ability to switch between different respiratory modes, allows them to survive the diverse environments. For example, larvae can efficiently breathe and respire underwater using gills. However, as they go through metamorphosis and become adults, they'll switch to lungs and skin respiration on land. So this allows for not only respiratory advantages, but also reproduction advantages by being able to have a more diverse area on where eggs may be laid to have a better chance of survival and fitness. They've then got webbed feet in many different amphibians across the globe. This allows for the toes to have increased surface area, providing greater propulsion in water. Even amphibians that are not fully water-based, such as a lot of frogs, but live in moist environments, this really helps them grasp onto leaves and things of that nature when jumping from plant to plant. Like mentioning earlier, you've got your elongated bodies and limbs. So the arboreal species benefit from those elongated limbs because it really allows them to have better climbing ability, jumping, and stability in trees. Whereas those burrowing species, such as the caecilians or burrowing frogs, although they have elongated cylindrical bodies that enable them to move through soil, this allows them to be able to do that with minimal resistance, so they're not going to have those legs or the bumpy skin or anything that could cause them to stop being able to move. You're also going to have your camouflage, which helps amphibians avoid predators by making them less visible in their surroundings. Outside of their morphological advantages, the three other main advantages that amphibians are able to use are those feeding advantages. That really allows for those long sticky tongues to allow for rapid prey capture, as well as hinged skull and wide mouth. This really allows them to consume prey much larger than their head, which allows them to have a wider diet and a wider range of food, which allows them to have that higher evolutionary fitness. You've then got your ecological advantages, such as that dual life cycle, which is what was mentioned specifically for frogs, where they'll have that larvae and then go through that metamorphosis and then evolve into an aquatic and terrestrial stages. So this dual life cycle really allows them to exploit resources in both cycles, as well as that habitat adaptability. Amphibians are found in a wide variety of ecosystems, from tropical rainforests to temperate woodlands, deserts to mountainous regions. They have adapted to live in diverse climates and can inhabit both freshwater and terrestrial environments. And then lastly, that diverse reproduction. So amphibians exhibit diverse reproduction strategies such as external fertilization in frogs, internal fertilization in salamanders, and direct development in some species where larvae develop directly into miniature adults. They can give birth via eggs or live birth, and again, this really allows them to take advantage of their environments and allows for higher fitness, which leads into that dual life cycle that was previously mentioned. So the last thing that we'll kind of be talking about today before wrapping up today's presentation is the biodiversity among the geographic regions. The most diverse area in the world is actually Melanesia, or more specifically New Guinea. This is because approximately 7.2% of Earth's recognized frog species occur in this land area, even though the region is only comprised of less than 0.7% of the world's land area. This allows for 534 species to live there. Although it's got the most dense population in regards to land area to animal species, most of the world's population of amphibians, or about approximately half of the planet's amphibians, are actually found in the neotropics. That's going to be more specifically Brazil, Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. And then the number of the most salamanders is actually going to be in the Neo-Arctic. This is 58% of amphibian species, and the United States actually has the most species with 209. And now that we have talked about the most diverse, we've got the least diverse region, which is Antarctica. And that's just because at this time, no species of amphibians have ever been found there. Amphibians have been found in every other habitat or continent in the world. So this is obviously just going to be the least diverse, with just the lack of species. Now specifically the biomes that amphibians can live in is pretty much any biome that exists. Most amphibians prefer to live in humid tropical habitats, such as those rainforests and wetlands. However, that does not stop them from being able to survive extreme environments such as the dry deserts and frozen tundras of the Arctic Circle. So frogs and toads have an 88% global diversity, salamanders and newts have 9% global diversity, and cicalians have a 3% global diversity, which will actually be seen a little bit more on the next slide, which will be able to be broken down through in visualizations. So as I mentioned, across the board, amphibians are pretty diverse throughout all of the world, which is going to be that bottom right, global amphibian species richness, as well as the very first of the maps on the left. You'll then have your small range amphibians, threatened amphibians, the salamanders, the frogs, and then the cicalians, and you'll be able to see specifically the regions that they are more heavily involved in. So this goes ahead and brings us to our conclusion, where we're just going to go ahead and wrap it up with some of the brief main points that we discussed today, where amphibians kind of split from fish approximately 470 million years ago, although they were not the first tetrapods. From amphibians came modern-day reptiles when they began splitting approximately 315 million years ago. There have been present in every single period since the Devonian age, although there has been little knowledge in the fossil record during the time of the dinosaurs, which is really when reptiles exploded. So during that time, amphibians were much smaller and the fossil record is much smaller. They do have some of the largest diversity, being in every continent but Antarctica, and are most diverse in New Guinea if you're taking into account landmass. However, most of the species are located in the natural tropics. Amphibians are made up of those three groups, the Anora, the Caudata, and lastly the Gymnophonia, and they have an ecological and morphological traits that allow them to adapt in every biome and diversify. They're most popular in forests. But that brings us to the end of our presentation. So thank you so much for going ahead and joining me today. I will go ahead and go on to my last slide, which is just going to be my references. But from there, that is it. Thank you so much and have a great day.